Truthfully Speaking Grace is a global podcast dedicated to connecting, celebrating, and inspiring listeners with empowering conversations. Join host Agatha Corbin as she gracefully builds with real people, sharing real stories, and unlocking real enlightening truth. Welcome. This is Truthfully Speaking Grace Podcast with your amazing host, Agatha Corbin, giving you real conversation with powerful topics and connecting with real inspirational people from all over the world. So sit back, relax, and let's get this podcast started.
This is Daniel Middleton sitting here with Agatha. I'm the executive producer for this show. Questions about your life experience there that I wanted to ask you about. Your grandfather served overseas in World War II. Do you know how long he was deployed overseas?
It was my dad, and I don't know. I can't remember. I have to look on his service records. But he was there for, I know, at least a year or two, or at least a year.
Wow.
Overseas.
So he actually saw combat while he was overseas?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Wow. And I'm sorry, I did say grandfather because my grandfather was also, he wasn't in World War II, but he was deployed overseas after World War II. I think he was deployed in Italy for about 3 or 4 years.
Yes.
So I'm sorry, that's why they made the association.
I do not get offended, Daniel, because a lot of times when I was a child and my parents went to parent-teacher conference, everyone would say, hey, is this your grandparents? Or, hey, is that your grandmom or your granddad? And I would be like, no, these are my parents. So I've learned to correct without being too offended because, yes, again, I had older parents.
Wow.
Yeah.
How much older are your brothers than you are?
Oh, wow. Let's see. I would say there's almost a 20-year difference between my older brother, Frank, and I, and about a 14-year difference between my middle brother, Benny, and I. So,
wow.
Yes.
That is a big gap.
Yeah. My oldest brother, Frank, and his then wife, who's no longer with us either, they had 3 children. And I grew up with my nieces and nephews like brothers and sisters, because either they were older than me or one of them was about the same age as I. So, wow. Yeah. They never really called me Aunt Peaches, but
that's definitely unique. There.
Yeah, very unique. Very unique.
Wow. Now, you mentioned that your parents also were foster parents. Were you still in contact with any of your foster brothers and sisters?
By the time I came around, Daddy said no more cheering. So, no, I haven't, but I know my brothers, both my brother Benny and Frank, grew up really around those foster children. They were around their age group.
Okay.
I do remember when I was a kid seeing maybe 2 of them that used to come around to my mom and dad and thank them, for taking them in. So definitely my mom and dad love children. Therefore, I love children. So
you came by it honest.
Came by it honest. Community, church, community, and kids. I mean, that's just, it was ingrained in me. So, which is a good thing. Made me the woman that I am now. Hopefully the mom that I am.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Back to your dad again.
Mm-hmm.
When he was overseas, he mentioned that he had some run-ins with racism over there, and I was kind of surprised. I heard that France was one of the more liberal countries over there. So hearing that he went through that in France was kind of surprising to me. Just to hear that.
Racism is everywhere. It may not have been as bad, but they still were. I mean, a lot of Europeans back in those days only heard, if they did see a black person or a black soldier, it was different for them because America depicted us as either animals or non-existent or domestic, but never really soldiers until they actually saw them.
Wow.
But my father, not saying that my mom didn't experience racism, but you have to remember they lived in their minds in two different parts of the country. My mom was a Texan, and she will tell you Texas was his own country back in those days. And my father lived in deep south of Alabama, and so their growing up was a little different. Like I said, my mom and my auntie grew up where, like I said, my grandmother and great-grandmother, they owned boarding homes and farms and churches and storefronts. Her family was Texas and Oklahoma. I was actually accidentally born in Oklahoma when they was visiting family, because that's where my grandfather was from on my mom's side. And so those stories you hear in history books of black towns, that's what my mother grew up, where their towns were mayors and they owned their properties and
Wow.
did things. They still experienced some racism, of course, but it was just a little different. My father, like I said, on the other hand, grew up at where his parents were true sharecroppers, and they worked the cotton field, all of them. Even to the day when I was a child, my family in Rockford worked at a cotton mill. I got to see a cotton mill. I actually wore the shirts from those cotton mills, which was so fascinating to me, because it was like, wow, this is like really from a cotton field that I saw. Unfortunately, my daddy and his siblings witnessed or heard of lynchings, My mother said, because they rode the train a lot in the West, to come back and forth. So she remembered train rides. And yes, there was some racism on some of the train rides. But she said she experienced more racism when she got to Ohio in the South than she ever did when she was out in the West.
That's deep.
Which was interesting. So they would argue. I remember nights they would just argue because they played cards, and they would just get into these arguments on what really happened back in the day. But in the end, they both had their stories. But for my father, it was more hurtful, more deep, because again, he witnessed things that he never wanted me or my brothers to witness.
Wow.
He probably didn't tell me stories to this day that he didn't think I should hear, but I can imagine what he went through being a black man in the South.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. He was a tall, strong, Southern black gentleman, always dressed to a T, same way. He always believed in being dapper. He was a dapper black man that, prided himself as a hard worker and, like I said, ex-military. So it's kind of cool watching my parents, how different they were, but how they complemented each other.
Wow. Mm-hmm. That is awesome. Growing up in the Great Depression, did he have any interesting stories about growing up in the Great Depression?
My mom did.
Okay.
My mom said she remembered the Blue John milk. Blue John milk was water. We call it 2% or less.
Wow.
And she said they call it Blue John milk because it was so light that it's almost blue. And they remember standing in lines for this milk, for the cheese, for the rice. They gave away rice. cornmeal and flour. And this is when she said during the Depression, there was no white, black. It was everybody was broke and poor and hungry. But the difference for the Afro-American community back then is that that's when they really pulled together. No one in the neighborhoods or in the house or in the family was hungry because they all pulled their resources. They actually garden. And I'm laughing because my parents had a garden in the backyard. Now, let me put my disclaimer. I did not inherit the green thumb of Angelina Corbin or Ralph Corbin. I killed a cactus in college. Okay? Had to give that antidote, okay? But, bless they hoard. They would send me out there in the back to work the garden. You know, I don't know. They tried.
Wow.
But back in the Depression, my mother said, with them growing up, and same with my father. Like my father, I don't think he really experienced it because to him, he said we was depressed from post-slavery. I mean, you know what I mean? What a real difference. I mean, because they were sharecropper family. You know what I mean? And they truly, when I went down south to visit my family, they actually had slaughterhouses. Yeah. You would think I'd be vegan by now, but oh my God. I mean, they grew up on farms and literally grew their food and cleaned it. So, well, both my parents had learned that, but that's all my dad knew. So he will say, you know, we was in the Depression all the time, but, you know, so it affected them, but he said, I lived it anyway, you know, versus my mom was more in the city, I guess towns during that time. She just remembered the lines, you know. But my grandmother and grandfather, my grandfather had a farm in Oklahoma. So again, that they experienced it, but it didn't devastate my family, and particularly for blacks because they had no choice but to grow their own things. Do things as a unit, as a family, as a community. Something I think is missing, but that's a whole nother podcast.
I agree. Thank you so much for sharing your stories with us today.
Thanks for listening to Truthfully Speaking Grace Podcast. Stay tuned for another episode with more real conversations, celebrating real and inspiring people from all around the world.